Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Megan Baerg and I am excited to have somebody back who I consider to be a friend and a mentor. We recently had a conversation and introduced some interesting topics. And so today we just wanted to take a little time and unpack those a bit. I am happy to welcome Lisa Kusch. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back. It's going to be some fun to unpack some of those discussions around CO2.
Yes, I'm excited for this. In our recent conversation, we talked about a few different things. We talked about actually quite a few things. And we dropped some words, some things, and we just kind of glanced over it. And one of those big subjects that we introduced was the topic or subject of hypocapnia. And you did give us a definition and did a brief explanation. So I wanted to just reiterate what that definition was. And then I want to just kind of get into a little bit of a conversation around hypocapnia, what it means and why it's important. So you had said in that video, you explained to us the scientific word for low CO2 or carbon dioxide in the blood. And you also said that some symptoms of hypocapnia were the outcomes of deficits of oxygen delivery to different parts of the body. So we addressed, I think, one symptom that was brain fog. And I just wanted to get in a little bit more and ask, what are some of the other symptoms of hypocapnia? And maybe if you could just review what it is briefly and why it's so important to kind of understand these symptoms and what they mean overall.
Great. So we could talk about this for a really long time because there's almost 300 symptoms of hypocapnia if we really start to get into it.
Wow.
But what I've prepared is to put it sort of into sections so that we can talk about different systems in the body and what kind of symptoms might show up for you if you've had breathing habits that are creating hypocapnic situations. And then your symptoms might be persistent over time, or they might be intermittent and only show up when your breathing habits are taking you into these low CO2 states.
Okay.
So for some people, and I think we need to be clear about that, there is clinical hypocapnia where there's an organic problem in the body. We're going to be talking about behavioral hypocapnia, where conscious and unconscious breathing habits are overriding our gas exchange, where we're using our breath to meet a need, whether that's in the moment or from our experience, and we're bringing it forward, predicting we need it again. If we're doing that, then we have behavioral hypocapnia.
Okay, thank you for that distinction, because I think that's really important to understand that, yeah, what we're talking about is the kind of breathing behavior driven causes, okay, or symptoms. Excellent.
Right. And our breathing behaviors can derail our reflexive respiration. Our pH balance that needs to be perfect is easily disrupted when we override our breathing.
Okay.
And when we do that, there's an instant metabolic domino effect. Instant. It can happen in a breath. If you take one breath that puts it out of alignment, you need a breath to bring it back. You take 3 breaths out of alignment, it's going to take longer to bring it back. And the longer that we're out of alignment, the more deficits start to occur and the longer it might take to recover. So if you've been hypocapnic because of your breathing behaviors for a long time, it becomes chronic. And when I say chronic behavioral hypocapnia, I mean your CO2 has been low for so long that you don't even notice. You're just used to it. It's normalized to you. And your symptoms have generalized. There might be a few in this system and a few in that system, and they kind of come and go depending on the time of day or the situation you're in. And so that's what we need to look at is, are you chronically hypocapnic or are you intermittently hypocapnic? Those are 2 different ways of being behaviorally hypocapnic. But so we drew a Venn diagram, would be all behavioral hypocapnia is one of those 2.
Okay.
But intermittent behaviors are not necessarily chronic behaviors.
Got it.
Some people are only hypocapnic, for example, after they work out. And then an hour later, they're fine.
Okay.
So that's an example. But in the general scheme of things, because of our innate wisdom and our physiology, wanting to keep us alive, there's sort of a few dominoes that fall in order every time. And that's where I wanted to start. So the first domino, like we talked about last time, is as soon as we become hypocapnic, even a little bit, we drop from that 37 range under 35, your nervous system is going to crank it up a bit. Your sympathetic drive is going to come up. Your arousal will come up. And you might even perceive that as anxiety. And it's like a low-lying 24-hour-a-day feeling of something's not quite right. I'm not getting enough in this situation, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And as humans, being as good as we are making stories, we project it into our external world because we don't know that it could be our breath. So right away, it's like, well, who's making me feel unsafe? Is this my stress? Is it that conversation I just had? Did I eat the wrong thing? When it could be that you took a few breaths too deep, too long in the wrong direction, and now you feel anxious because there's not enough oxygen in your prefrontal cortex.
That is so important because I think this is something that I for sure have experienced, but I think this is I asked for the common symptoms, and this is such a huge common symptom that I think just we're not aware of. Like that's wow. Okay.
And that's the low-hanging fruit, right?
Okay.
So the number of times in a day where you feel just a little anxious for no apparent reason or a little brain fog, you've probably lowered your CO2 in response to something in your environment you haven't noticed. If that was to continue, the next domino to fall is the gut. Because if your body isn't getting enough oxygen, and it really needs you to figure it out, it will prioritize all of your other organs and slow the gut down, and in chronic cases, shut the gut down so that you have enough oxygen to figure out what's going on. You don't need to digest food if your physiology thinks you're trying to stay alive. This is an emergency. So when you have intermittent gut issues or long-term chronic gut issues, I always look at CO2 first to see, does the person have a long-term breathing habit that has lowered the available oxygen to the gut lining, which then creates a domino effect in the microbiome and in the ability to uptake nourishment.
So let me just clarify something. In the other video we talked about, or you mentioned carbon dioxide from a metabolic point of view and how you need the carbon dioxide to release the oxygen into the cell, correct? Yes. Now, when you talk about a deficit of oxygen, does carbon dioxide do anything else other than kind of that, you talked about the concierge and the janitor, the ability to let the oxygen in, but then also at the same time, let the waste out. Is there anything else that carbon dioxide does that would also limit that oxygen to the areas like the gut you've just mentioned? If the gut has a decrease in oxygen, then there's not enough oxygen in the system, meaning there's not enough carbon dioxide. Is that correct?
Right. We could do a whole session just on the interchange of how a CO2 deficit creates mitochondrial problems and energy production issues and ATP issues. Energy made in the cell to promote the energy needed to complete whatever task that organ or cell is set for. So in the gut lining, if we don't have proper CO2, we have lower oxygen delivery, which means then the cellular reproduction is lower. The available nourishment to the lining of the gut, and not just that, but to the movements of the intestinal tract, all of that is less because it doesn't have what it needs. It can't create the energy it needs to complete the task. And then it continues to fight deficits in those areas. So for abdominal issues, the low-hanging fruits, the first dominoes, are the easier ones. If you have low CO2 abdominally, you're first of all probably going to be someone who's feeling nauseous, but don't know why. It comes and goes. Vomiting, it can go up to vomiting. Cramping, high stomach cramping. Bloating can be as a result of low CO2. And then intermittent pain in different places in the intestinal tract. And then that can go further down into inflammation, and then we get a vicious cycle happening where the body is trying to create the problems that were created by the problems.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. I don't want to get too stuck in the weeds on the heavy science, but yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And then to take another step back, if we're talking about the autonomic stressor and feeling that little bit of anxiety, if that's not met right away and the gut has to start to shut down, well, then what happens? We feel fatigue.
Mm.
Fatigue as a symptom is really important to notice, because fatigue is not an enemy. Fatigue is your friend. Fatigue is saying, our resources are otherwise occupied. Sit down. Like, we're trying to keep something going over here, so don't move. We don't have enough for that. It's a flag. Chronic fatigue is when we haven't been able to solve the low CO2 deficit. And now we have problems trying to solve problems, right? And that will start off with headaches, roving muscle pains, and even limb weakness. So even as I'm just saying these, how many different kinds of disorders come to mind, right? We won't go into those right now because I want to get through all of the symptoms and deficits that someone might notice first. And then from there, the next level would be cardiovascular. You might notice a change in the way your heart is beating. It might be beating faster. You might feel palpitations, but it's weaker but faster. And you might have tachycardia, up and down, right? Arrhythmias from the body trying to get as much as it can, but now we have a vasodilation all throughout the system, including in the heart. So it has to work harder for less, right? That can even lead to angina symptoms, or what we call angina symptoms, right? Where you feel pressure around the heart, where there's a squeezing, but no other heart symptoms. And at the long end of it, you can even have ECG abnormalities from being hypocapnic.
Wow. Really?
I have seen that with clients who've called me from the hospital, and I'll go in and they have irregular abnormalities, even AFib, and we're able to turn it around by bringing their CO2 levels back up.
Wow. Yeah. Huh.
So those are the top three. And then that cognitive piece takes the big hit, right? So then you're going to have attention issues. Why? Because your body won't let you focus on anything that isn't solving the problem. If we think about attention deficit again as a solution to a problem, it's not a deficit. It's an attention arousal where you look here, nope, that's not it. You look here, nope, that's not it. You look here, well, that might be it. I'm going to hyper focus there until I realize that's not it. Now I got to do the next thing. That's a defense mechanism to keep us going until we find out why we're not getting what we need. I think it's phenomenal, right? So if we reframe that, same with learning deficits. We can't process new information the way we want to in a prefrontal cortex that's 40 to 60% deficit of oxygen delivery, that's experiencing vasoconstriction. We can't make the new connections. It slows down the ability to make new neural connections.
So why, I'm going to ask this question, why would there be vasoconstriction in the prefrontal cortex if your CO2 is low?
So when the CO2 is low and the body wants you to find out why, it will reroute the available oxygen to the hindbrain, the amygdala, and the brainstem, so that you get into that sympathetic arousal,
right,
to figure out the problem. So it's like it's not fight or flight. I don't like to call it that. It's an activated arousal.
Okay.
Right. And then when it does that, it's deviating from the prefrontal cortex because it's giving you a danger signal. So it eliminates our ability. So vasoconstriction, the other part of that question, comes from the big piece we talked about last time. If our CO2 is not available to exchange oxygen into the cell, that means the cells themselves in our veins and arteries are now at a deficit and they constrict. So now we have less oxygen getting into those cells and it tightens. And we have blood that's oxygen rich, but not enough CO2 to empty it. So it raises your blood pressure and it speeds up your blood pressure to try and get that remaining oxygen to the places it needs to get to.
Wow.
To the CO2 that's available.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting what you just said about the prefrontal cortex and kind of the rerouting to the hindbrain, because so much is being spoken right now of, nervous system regulation and all of these things that are important. And so how does that correlate? It's important to understand, I think, that if you're finding that you're exhibiting symptoms of a dysregulated nervous system, that you really should be checking your CO2 levels, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
It's just like the nail in your shoe,
Ah,
right? If you've got a nail in your shoe and you're walking on it, it's going to hurt and it's going to bleed, and you're going to start favoring your other leg, and you're going to create compensations. And if you go to the doctor and nobody ever takes off your shoe to see the nail, they're going to start treating you for a limp, and they're going to look at your joints, right? And they're going to try and figure out, do you have early arthritis? What's going on? They're going to start looking for organic things. We have to look at the behavioral first. And if we take the behavioral aspect and bring the CO2 level back to normal by ameliorating any behaviors that aren't serving us in the breathing realm, then whatever's left is the real problem.
hmm,
So if they look in your shoe and they take the nail out, they're going to go, well, you have a hole in your foot because you were walking on this. Now let's heal your foot.
right.
Set the nail down. And now we're going to solve the problems caused by the problem. Right.
I think that's so important for people to know, because there's so much, and it doesn't mean that these aren't practices and things that aren't helpful, but there's so much buzz around nervous system regulation and all of the things that kind of fall into that category or have become to fall into that category, including breathing interventions and all of these things that really, wow, that's just such an impactful idea, really.
It is. And I think that we would revolutionize the school system and in the screening of learning deficits with early intervention if we were watching kids in grades 1 to 3 for their breathing behaviors. That's well within the scope of practice for resource room teachers, special education teachers, school psychologists.
Wow. Yeah.
And if they saw that, it could be ameliorated before the child starts to experience learning problems and gets labeled as attention deficit, right? Or some other form of neurodiversity, which we see expanding in the schools, right? So even in the neurodiversity communities, we're not looking at the behaviors of breathing. And they do implicate. They can create, they can mimic, and they can, if it's happening for another reason, they can make it much worse if you have breathing behaviors that are creating hypocapnia. So as a screening tool, it would be amazing for people to know if they are hypocapnic.
I think for everybody. What are some ways in which somebody might know other than symptoms? Is there a way that somebody might know that they're in a hypocapnic state other than symptoms, or is symptom kind of display the number one way in which you would know?
On your own, low tech, you would only know from your weird symptoms that nobody can seem to find an organic cause for. You've gone in for all the blood work. Your doctor says, well, we'll look at this, we'll look at that. Your massage therapist is chasing muscle spasms around the body. Your physiotherapist, your chiropractors, your naturopathic doctors are giving you supplements and they don't seem to be making a change. Then what's happening? There's something underneath that. So if you're not getting what you should be getting out of treatments, but you have roving symptoms, you should check your breathing.
Good to know.
And then if you're on your own, that's where you'd have to go. If you have access to someone who has breathing experience and training, then you could look at handheld devices called capnometers, where Capno goes, and you could put that on. It measures your end-tidal CO2. Yes, exactly, that little lovely right there. And you can have a screening to know if you have low CO2 in just a few minutes. And if it looks normal, then you can test the parameters. In what situations do you have those symptoms? And then you can get yourself in those situations or create the symptoms in the office with somebody to see how you might be adding unconsciously to that symptom package. We'll call them a package.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any more? I keep derailing your symptoms. Are there any more symptoms? What are some other symptoms that people might experience?
In the cognitive realm, we're at poor memory. Then there's brain fog, inability to think, word loss while you're talking. At the extreme states, you create dissociation, where you don't remember parts of your day because you've actually created a different state in the brain. So you could be learning in different states. You could be living in different states according to where you are in your life. And again, these are solutions. Why are we doing that? We've changed the breathing to meet a need, and that need is usually safety. Right? You could be experiencing long-term dizziness, fainting, confusion, hallucinations. You could have extreme anxiety. You could have trouble with anger regulation, fears or phobias that don't seem to go away, even though cognitively you have tried to change your beliefs around them, but you just can't seem to make it go. A lot of crying or sort of mood swings or mood instability can be from low CO2. And then in movement, diminished coordination. Right? Fine motor skills, a little slower than usual, or just can't seem to get things done the way that you used to. Reaction times, balance, and perceptual judgment. That's all under movement. Man. Right? So that's big for performance and art, but it's also big for little kids learning new skills. Like, how do you handwrite? How do you learn to print new letters and words if you're hypocapnic? Yeah. So if we go from the movement into the muscles, then you might experience tetany, which is this like weird tingly feeling. Sometimes it happens in the hands or the feet, and it can go into like feels like a muscle spasm, and they get cold. So there can also be hyper reflexes, or reflexes that should have disappeared but didn't. So there's a persistence in a reflex. Spasms, generalized weakness in different muscle groups. Fatigue, as we talked about before. So if you're getting fatigue in a muscle group, listen to it. Because there's a lack there. It can't meet the need you're asking it to meet. Right? Fatigue is your friend. Pain, you can also have difficulty to swallow and chest discomfort from low CO2. Because all of those muscles are starting to tighten up from the inability to get enough oxygen. That goes over into the performance zone. So when we're talking about performance, that slides firstly into sleep, because nobody can get anything done without good sleep. And long-term hypocapnia can create not just sleep disorders, but it can lead into apnea. And that's kind of the irony, is that at the end of the day, and this is really important for people to understand, sleep apnea is when it's not just snoring, it's when you stop breathing while you're sleeping. Why do people stop breathing while they're sleeping? Because their CO2 got so low that if the body didn't stop respiration, it would have a heart attack.
Wow.
So the apnea is the body's solution to overbreathing in sleep. The apnea occurs so the CO2 can come back up so that you can get oxygen flowing again. And when it brings that CO2 back up and the chemoreceptors fire when you hit normal, you also get an adrenal hit so that you wake up and don't do that again. And this is part of that whole spectrum of disordered sleeping that comes from breathing. It's a breathing disordered sleep. It takes 90 minutes for an adrenal hit like that to clear your system. And then people wonder why they wake up suddenly in the middle of the night and then they can't get back to sleep. They probably had an apneic situation and their body woke them up. So if you take a sleeping pill because you can't sleep and you have that happening, now your body has to work twice as hard to wake you up. It still needs the apnea to get the oxygen. And now it has to work twice as hard to wake you up. So that's how we get ourselves into crazy vicious cycles with hypocapnia if it goes undiagnosed or unnoticed because it's behavioral. You might also have hypocapnia even just in simple things like rehearsing. I have to give a speech today, and while I'm thinking about it, I start breathing in my chest. I start thinking about the crowd. Am I going to start breathing up here? You're going to notice it in, well, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would think that would happen a lot with public speaking and people who speak for a living, you know. I mean, to an extent, we all speak for a living, but people whose job it is to constantly be speaking, public speakers or lawyers or those sorts of professions.
Exactly. And I've had some interesting interchanges with people who speak for a living. For example, prosecutor, lawyer that I've worked with, who is really well known in his field, gets the job done, but came to see me because he couldn't figure out why he had such bad anxiety to the point where he was pouring sweat before appearances in court. And he's like, I've done all the breathing exercises. I should be calm. So I had him show me the breathing exercise, and the breathing exercise he was doing was lowering his CO2 to the point where he was dissociating.
Oh, wow. Huh.
And he's been doing it for decades. So now he has extra symptoms from this chronic overbreathing that he only does in this one part of his life. It was fascinating. And so in just a few sessions, we worked it out. He was able to go back into court without overbreathing. And all those symptoms went away.
Wow. Wow.
And he's still a good lawyer, like he's always been. It didn't change his function in that way.
Right.
Really interesting. We were at muscle function. We talked about that. Peripheral. So peripheral symptoms that people might experience: numbness. Numbness in nerve endings, numbness in hands and toes, anywhere in the body, really. You might just experience numbness. Trembling or twitching. You just have a little twitch. What if it's not your coffee? What if it's the way you breathe after you drink coffee? And then you get a little eye twitch.
Yes,
right?
I've had.
So trembling, twitching, shivering, getting really cold. If you're always cold, even when it's warm up, that's probably a CO2 thing that needs to be checked out. Probably have a breathing habit that's sabotaging your thermal regulation. Right? And the same thing for sweating. People that are sweating all the time out of context, really cold or always sweaty. And sometimes it's together, cold and sweaty. How weird is that? And when you see those symptoms together, that's another indication of hypocapnia. It can be indications of other things too, but if you don't get the hypocapnia out of the way, you can't tell if it's organic. I know I'm going to say that over and over again. Psychologically, you could have shifts in personality. So if you start to behave like it's not really you, or someone says, well, what's wrong with you? It's not how you act usually. Self-esteem might change. Memory of historic events might change. Emotional and thought processing might change. And then what we would think when we talk about breathing as this is what we should say when we would notice first would be shortness of breath, but it isn't for everybody. So shortness of breath might be a symptom. Airway resistance, because then your bronchioles in your chest aren't getting the oxygen delivery they need. So they start to tighten up. And now you feel like the air isn't getting where you want it to because there's resistance. It's like having a stuffy nose. So what do? We breathe harder, which is the exact opposite of what our body needs us to do. It needs us to breathe softer in that moment. Yeah. So those are some of them. Bronchial constriction can even create asthma symptoms. From a prediction of constriction, you can create it with your breathing. Sensory-wise, you might have blurry vision. So if you have blurry vision that comes and goes, you only need reading glasses at certain times of the day. That's interesting.
Wow. I just keep saying wow, because I mean, wow.
Yeah. Or sounds seem far away, even though usually you can hear them and now they seem far away. That's a symptom of hypocapnia because your sensory pieces are being affected. Reduced pain threshold and dry mouth. Why would dry mouth be a symptom of hypocapnia? It's interesting. It's because usually if we have hypocapnia, we feel like we're not getting enough breath. We start mouth breathing.
Okay.
Yeah. And the mouth is feeling dry. You can have smooth muscle problems, which is including your heart, your brain, your bronchioles, your gut, ocular, we're just talking about the eyes, your liver, and placentas if you're pregnant. It can cause vasoconstriction in the placenta that can actually lead to a preterm miscarriage.
Hmm.
So all of those things are symptoms.
Wow.
If we'll just like let the symptoms just rest there and people can just hang with that for a bit.
Well, and I think it points to, for me, I'm hearing it all, and it points to how amazingly intelligent and miraculous the human body actually is, in that, it will develop these things in search of the cause, which is amazing, really. And I think it also shows, I said it's in the last call, just how nuanced breath is. We know so much about it, and in so many ways, we're just scratching the surface.
Exactly.
And so I think it's important to understand that, again, the science is important, but it really is the psychophysiology and the behavior around the breathing that I think well, not I think, it is so important, and it can be so impactful for somebody. And so I think it's just really interesting how, again, breathing behavior is kind of at the center of all of this. It is the center of all of this. Is that a fair statement, do you think?
It's the center in that it is the overlooked.
Yes.
The most overlooked health marker is that we can disrupt our acid-base balance and no one's noticing. It's an assumption that our CO2 levels are normal and that we haven't paired our breathing to stress responses or pain responses or emotional responses, or just to lifting the weights, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just to feel coordinated, we might be dysregulating ourselves. That is what's been overlooked. And that's why it's the most important health marker. It's a behavior.
I think that's really important to understand and to know. The one thing I want to kind of finish off with, and I'm not sure if this is going to be a quick answer to a question, but you mentioned in the other video that we are a society that's normalized the symptoms of low CO2. And we've kind of danced around why that is, but why do you think that is? And how do we change that? How do we begin to change that?
Right. Well, it's become normalized because it's so typical. Everyone has a few symptoms of low CO2 from time to time. And most of the time it's because we learned it from someone else. We learned how to breathe in response to something by someone else, right? And it runs in families. We can have everyone knows a whole family that everybody mouth breathes when they eat. Just think about the people that you know. There's certain people that when you eat, they mouth breathe. And wow, their siblings do that and their parents do that. That's interesting. It's obviously not just a throat issue. It's a familial issue. So how does this become normalized? Because we are saying, oh yeah, that's just our genetics. Yeah. We're also not recognizing the other forms of stressors that are creating a hypocapnic response, where lowering our CO2, and I did mention this previously, but it always bears repeating, is why in the world would any human want to have less oxygen in their brain? And then keep it that way and remain a high functioning contributor to society, but with not quite enough in their brain. Why? We learned that because at some point it helped us avoid pain. And so feeling everything, being completely present was too difficult in a specific situation. And we learned to get things done with less as a protective measurement. So we have an entire society that's just on the edge of fear all the time. We've normalized it. We're all on the edge of fear all the time. And we're going to stay there, because if we come into feeling everything, it's overwhelming. But if people understood what was going on and the domino effects long terms and the interplay. I think this is like what you and I are doing. It's one discussion at a time.
Right.
Until we can get it systemically out there, because behavioral health is so important. And there are lots of movements coming up in the medical field where they see that behavioral health is sort of the new frontier. Behavioral medicine has really grown. The research shows that if we take care of the behaviors, a lot of the disease and disorders come down.
Well, and
that's the piece.
Yeah, and I think that we're in an interesting time where there is a lot more awareness and there is a lot more understanding in a lot of these areas that, 5, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't have a focus or even an awareness that that might be a thing. And so I think, it's great that we're able to have these conversations and kind of an education per se.
One of the things that I'd like to maybe wrap up with in terms of how do we change it is for people to recognize that if they are experiencing a bundle of symptoms, they might say, oh, that was really good information, but you know what? I already know that I'm just hypoglycemic. My doctor told me I'm hypoglycemic. So it's not my breathing. But actually, hypoglycemia is a symptom of low CO2. It's a physiologic effect of low CO2. So now that means you're getting treatment for the symptom of your behavior. And it's a real symptom and it can cause real problems. This isn't to say that there's no real issues. It's that what if those real issues could be completely gone? What if all you have to do is change one part of your breath?
Well, and I
Would
think
you want to be on medication for the rest of your life, or learn how to allow yourself to breathe the way your body expects you to breathe?
Well, and I think this is the right, there's a lot of conversation about getting to the root cause of things, when it comes to health and wellness and all of these things. There are movements out there and there's a lot of conversation around getting to the root cause. And I think that this is such an impactful, like my hope is that this is an education and people can go, oh my goodness, I didn't know this, for the people who, like you said, have been chasing different symptoms, or different health professionals have been chasing different things and haven't been able to kind of, this might be an avenue to pursue. And so in that kind of spirit of things, how can people get a hold of you? If somebody listening is that person that's like, oh my goodness, I need to see somebody about this. We didn't mention this at the top of the video, but you are a breathing behavior analyst. That is one of your very many talents and very many credentials. And so how can people get a hold of you? How can people find you?
People can find me through my website. I own and run Conspire Health. It is a full clinic ready to work with wherever you're at with your breathing, and we can work with you online or in person. On the website, you can also submit a screening so that we can take a look at what your breathing behaviors might be up front, and then we'll coordinate to have a free consult before we move ahead with any type of full assessment. We'd like to do that for everybody. And you can call me there, you can email me there. It's at connect@conspirehealth.ca. And you can watch for other videos and podcasts and trainings that will have coming up. I'm also on faculty at the Professional School of Breathing Sciences, where I took my master's degree in applied breathing sciences. So there's a few ways to find me, and I would love to help answer any questions. And if anybody wants, maybe next time we can also go through, what do those bundles look like? What are the physiological effects of your breathing habits? Like hypoglycemia, there's about 40. We can maybe go through those.
Okay, I think we will end this video here. I said this in the previous video we did, that I think this is just going to be a series of conversations because there's just so much gold to unpack. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments anything you'd like us to discuss, or if you have any questions that Lisa could answer in a next conversation. If you like this video, then I think you'll like this other video that we had where we talk about all sorts of things: breathing behavior, breath work, breathing sciences. I'll link that And all of Lisa's information will be linked in the description below. Have a great day and goodbye.